Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rabbi Michael Ross. I'm delighted to be back to do some study with you. Today's study will be a little bit different. Instead of the Parsha, we're going to look at the Haftorah. And the Haftorah that normally aligns with Parshat Pinchas is the Haftorah about Elijah. So we're going to be on page 938. This, however, is not the Haftorah that's going to be read this morning. Because it is the weeks before Tisha B'Av, they'll be doing the Tisha B'Av stuff. I wanted to share with you some learning I've been doing about Elijah. So we're going to learn a story about Eliyahu Hanavi. And I want to start with...
Rabbi, could you give the name of the Haftorah rather than the page number?
Sure.
Or in addition to?
It is the Haftorah for Pinchas. It's 1 Kings chapter 19.
What about this verse?
Yeah, we might go back. So let's start with the blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we're going to be reading about Eliyahu Hanavi. And when most of us think about that, we think about the song that we sing either at Havdalah or at Seder. Eliyahu.
Yeah.
Eliyahu Hatishbi. Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagi. So many of our annotations, references, thoughts about Elijah come from singing that song. Right? We spend so much of our emotional connection to this kind of gets evoked from the melodies of Eliyahu. So let's start with that. When do we welcome Elijah? Bris. Why? Why at the bris? Why do we welcome Elijah at the bris?
The fact that he didn't supposedly die.
Yeah, he never dies in the story, right? He's taken up in a whirlwind to heaven. And according to the Midrash, he never dies. He becomes angelic in the heavenly realm. Therefore, why do we welcome him at the bris, at each bris? He's the harbinger of the Messiah. He will be the one who announces the coming of the Messiah. Same reason is given for Seder. At the end of the Passover Seder, when we're thinking about the future and how we're going to think about next year in Jerusalem, before we get to that moment, we welcome Elijah in. And the cup of Elijah is honored. We'll actually spend a few moments at the end talking about the cup of Elijah as well, because I think that for me is an important part of why I want to teach this text today. The third time we welcome Elijah is at the Havdalah ceremony, at the end of the Havdalah ceremony, after we separated from the time of holiness. Same reason that if Elijah is going to come to welcome the Messiah, he ought to do that during Shabbat, because then we'll just stay in Shabbat consciousness the rest of our lives. If it's a messianic world, the Messiah is supposed to be announcing a messianic existence, and that will be an eternal Shabbat. So we won't have to transition. The easiest transition would be for Elijah to show up Friday afternoon right before Shabbat, enjoy Shabbat with us, and then have it, will be existing in an eternal Shabbat. So these are the three moments that we think about Elijah and Elijah's role in our Jewish life today. But what I want to do to start this off is to think about the Elijah of the story in the Tanakh is very different than the song that we sing. The Elijah that we sing about has evolved and transformed himself through the Midrash and through the Zohar and through the Kabbalah. And Danny Matt has a brand new book that is very fun reading. It is called Becoming Elijah. I'll pass this around. You can swing it around that way.
I'll see it later.
And so what Danny Matt is a professor of Jewish studies in Berkeley, California. His big claim to fame is he is the guy who translated the Zohar. He spent 20 years of his life translating the Zohar out at Stanford University for Stanford University Press. And in his research about the Zohar, he was discovering all these amazing stories about Elijah. And so he has collected these stories in this little book. And the way he moves through this short book, he talks about Elijah in the Tanakh, the stories of Elijah that we have in the Bible. Then he talks about the rabbinic midrash that gets layered on that amplifies the role of Elijah. And then he says the third level of Elijah's character development happens with the mystics, the Kabbalists and the Zohar, how they take the rabbinic midrash and they go crazy with it. And that's what we're left with today is this crazy inflated Elijah who is going to be our mystical shepherd. We're always on the lookout for Elijah. We're always trying to think about when Elijah is going to be present with us. So we're going to look at a story about Elijah the prophet. And as we dive into this story, I want to have one word of introduction. This is not the introductory story of Elijah, chapter 19 in Kings. This is actually the second story. If we go back to chapter 18, chapter 18 is Elijah going to battle with the hundreds of other false prophets. Jezebel, the queen in the north, has gathered these band of prophets to do this idol worship stuff, and Elijah is furious at them, and God is furious, and God sends Elijah to deal with these false prophets. And there's a big test on Mount Carmel, and Elijah comes in and he says, you prophets try and bring down God's wrath, and they can't. And Elijah says, I'll do it. And God sends fire down just like he does with Nadav and Avihu, blasts the campsite, blasts all the false prophets, they die. This is the story after that. And in the story after that, Jezebel is going to be furious at Elijah. She still doesn't think Elijah is worthy of her adversarial relationship. She's going to send out a death notice to try and kill him. So that's our background for this. Any questions about?
Can you back up a little bit
Yeah.
further and give me a chronology?
Time, yes, thank you. Perfect. So,
And who these people are.
so exactly. Good. Thank you for that question. If we're thinking about the timeline of when this story is supposed to be taking place, we can think it is after King David, after King Solomon, and after the Jerusalem has been divided because King Solomon put a heavy tax burden onto the 10 tribes in the north. So the 12 tribes of Jerusalem, of Israel, have come together to build the temple in Jerusalem. But Solomon makes a fatal flaw. He puts a 1-month tax burden on everyone in the country to come in and spend a month doing slave labor to build the temple. It's a pretty hefty tax, especially if you're living up in Carmel and you only visit Jerusalem 3 times a year at Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Like, you're going to spend a month of your life every year.
I look at that as a light tax. I pay 25-30% now.
Okay.
That's only like 8%.
For them, it was too heavy. For them,
And it was a one-time thing.
such a heavy tax burden that they rebel. The 10 tribes of the north say, we're done. We're not doing this Jerusalem thing. You've built the temple, we're out. The temple is done. We're going to take all of our wealth, because they are the wealthy folks. Up in the north is where all the farms are in Israel. And they're going to say, you folks in Jerusalem, you do it by yourself. And a civil war ensues for centuries. the 10 tribes in the north, according to the Tanakh, fall into these pagan practices of idol worship alongside Adonai. They have these Baalim and these Asherot. These are long rods, fertility gods and goddesses. So they're praying to Adonai, and they're also praying to the fertility gods and goddesses. That's when Elijah comes in. Elijah is perhaps the first prophet in the north to say, you northerners, you kind of screwed up. You should be still doing the Jerusalem thing. You should be doing the Yud Hey Vav Hey Adonai stuff. You kind of went too far here. So he's there to rebuke them. No one likes to be rebuked. And so part of this is pretty cruel to take on a couple hundred prophets and then kill them. And so he's kind of in the aftermath of that great test where he succeeds in being terribly cruel.
Right, so Ahab was a king south, right?
Ahab is a king in the north.
Ahab is a king in the north. How many kings after Solomon is he?
Like the second.
Okay, it's
He's
not
one of
that
the,
far.
yeah, he's one. So
And
if we're,
Jezebel is who?
she's the wife. So if we're thinking like timeline, the timeline is, if King David is 950 BCE, if Solomon is about 930, we're saying maybe 875, maybe 850, 870, somewhere like
Yeah, I wasn't looking for
a
year, I'm looking
generation
for how
or
many
two after
generations
Solomon.
later.
Century count of
Yeah.
BCE.
One more historical piece that's really important about this text. The text of Kings doesn't get written the next year in 874 or even 864. It gets probably written around 500. So it takes them 375 years to write this story. And we know that after 375 years, stuff is gonna shift and change, and it might get written for reasons different than whatever happened in 875.
Unfortunately, that's the way I feel about the Torah. too.
Yeah. So part of this is we have to think that the motivation for this text to be compiled is to speak in conversation with the Torah itself.
Because Elijah is compared with Pinchas.
So what the question I want us to think about when we dive into this is why Elijah is compared to Pinchas. That's the question that I want to frame our study on. And then I'll have a second question in about 10 minutes.
Is
when
your
we dive in.
midrash the same person?
Yes, yes.
Or Pinchas doesn't die either?
There's a midrash, not only that they're the same soul, like get reincarnated, but that Pinchas, let me get this straight.
Pinchas and Elijah are the only two zealots.
They're the only two zealots. Right, the term kana is used not only for God and the Ten Commandments, but here for both Pinchas and for Elijah. And there is this idea of Gilgulim, reincarnation, that they're the same soul. So that's kind of our framing here. Okay, I'm going to start us on chapter 19. Can you take the opening verse, that opening paragraph when Ahab told?
When Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah has done and how he had put all the prophets to the sword, Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "Thus and more may the gods do just by this time tomorrow. I have not made you like one of them."
So she just put out his death warrant. If her soldiers find Elijah, they already killed him. You're Elijah, you're the prophet, you're God's chosen one. And you find out there's a death warrant against you by Jezebel. What do?
Lee.
Yeah, and that's what he does. He's gonna get away. Okay, so can we move to our next reader? Can you take the next one, verse 3, Frank? Let's do this one. Let's do both. So do Hebrew first and then English.
ויבוא באר שבע אשר ליהודה, וינח את נערו שם.
Okay, now in English.
frightened, he fled at once for his life. He came to Beersheba, which is in Judah, and left his servant there.
Okay, so let's say a couple things about the language that we're noticing. First, the nation of Israel is divided into two groups, right? We know in the Civil War here was the North and the South. The North is now called Israel, the South is now called Judah. Okay, so he was in the North, in Israel. He was up in Carmel in the North. Where has he fled to? Beersheba. It's in the South. So he knows, A, he's left the region of Israel. He's now in Judah and he's in Beersheba. Think about it from his perspective. If he keeps going, where would he come to next after Beersheba? Sinai Desert. And he could get to the Sinai Mountain very soon, right? So he's in Beersheba at this moment. Okay. Let's do next reader, if you could take verse 4, he himself.
And he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush and sat down under it and prayed that he might die. Enough, he cried, now, or take my life, for I am no better than my father's.
Okay.
So why did he flee if he wanted to die anyway?
I don't think he wants to die by the hands of Jezebel.
Okay.
I think he wants to die on his own terms, or maybe complaining about to God. Maybe he wants God involved in the death, perhaps. We know of another story. I was studying this last night at Temple Beth Shalom in Hudson. And one of my students there said, this is just like Jonah. Jonah wanting to die because no one will listen to him. And we talked last night that the life of a prophet is hard. Nobody wants to listen to rebukes, to criticism that you're always wrong. And Jonah and Elijah seem to be suffering the same fate, that they're there as God's messengers and everyone hates them and they feel very lonely. And they're trying to run away from whatever they're supposed to be doing to get away from being God's messenger. What I want to think about now, though, is to not compare Elijah too closely with Jonah, but I want you for the next minute to think about a different prophet, Moses. Because what Elijah will do now is he will go to Har Sinai and he will have an encounter with God, just like Moses does. And if we think of all the Elijah stories, each one of them is somehow a duplication of something Moses has done. So.
But we do mention Elijah at the Brit Milah and the Seder.
Yeah, you came a few moments late. And so we talked at the beginning that we have 3 moments where we ritually invoke Elijah. And that is at Seder, at Havdalah, and at Brit Milah. And so part of this is to figure out the difference between that Elijah that we're invoking and the Elijah of the text in our Haftorah text.
Yeah. And is it possible that he cried because he didn't know what to do?
Sure, could be. We don't know the psychology of Elijah, and we do know the plight of the prophet is very, very complicated. So he could be certainly exasperated. Yeah.
In some ways, I know this may be off the topic, but this is a foretelling, a foreshadow of Jesus.
Yes.
Jesus also.
So what I want you to do is hold that point for about 10 minutes. Because we're going to come back to that when we get to how the rabbis will interpret this text. Because the other rabbis, the other teachers at the time of the rabbis will have the same interpretation. They'll be looking at the Midrash on Elijah and going, yeah, we've got our own Midrashic understanding here.
And it's interesting because we're pretty sure the Seder was not the last meal.
Exactly, right.
But the use of the Seder and our use of the Seder which came first.
Right.
It was-
Yeah, we'll get there. So let's hold the rabbinic midrashim on Elijah for a few minutes, but we will circle back. Thank you. Okay, we're now on verse 5. And if the next reader can pick up with verse 5 and go ahead and take 5 and 6. No,
Did it? Okay. He lay down and fell asleep under a broom brush. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." He looked about, and there beside his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, or the journey will be too much for you." He arose and ate and drank, and with the strength from that meal, he walked 40 days and 40 nights as far as the mountain of God at Horeb. There he went into a cave, and there he spent the night.
So 2 comparisons to Moses, right? The first one is the 40 days and 40 nights that Moses spends on Mount Sinai getting the first tablets. And the second comparison is when Moses goes back up Har Sinai the second time and asks to see God's face. What does God do? God says, "No, you can't see my face and live. I'm going to hide you in the cleft of the rock." Here, Elijah is hiding in the cave, which is something like the cleft of the rock. Okay, so we've got all of a sudden the text saying this is something similar to Moses going up to Sinai and having that conversation with God. And we know from that story, chapters 19 and 20 of Exodus, it's a big thunder and lightning show. It's a rock concert, right? It's a big production. We're now going to look at this production and compare those 2 moments. So next reader, if you could take the first paragraph on 939, then the word.
Then the word of the Lord came to him. He said to him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" He replied, "I am moved by zeal for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left, and they are out to take my life. Come out," he called, "and stand on the mountain before the Lord."
And so here in this text, we see that Eliyahu identifies himself as being, "I am moved by zeal," right? The Hebrew here, tinati, that in the text of the Torah, God is the only one who's given permission to be zealous. Pinchas in this week's parsha will act zealously. And it's this strange spiritual dynamic. What happens when someone acts zealously?
And in our parsha, God justifies Pinchas's act of putting the sword through Cosby and Zimri by saying, "You've picked up my zeal."
Yeah.
You know, and because of your zeal, because you're doing what I want, basically, I'm going to stop the plague
Yes.
against the.
And what's his reward for this?
He became a Kohen.
Never pick up a sword again. He will never be permitted to hold a sword again in his hand.
That's the covenant of peace.
But that wasn't his reward was that he became a Kohen.
Yes, right. And if we see, so if we look at in the Torah text where it says a covenant of peace, a breach shalom, the vav in the word shalom is broken.
Mhm.
A broken covenant. Fascinating, yeah.
God knows what, that he's left the other country. I mean, it's a very strange question. He also sent the angel.
It's no different
Yeah,
than.
but
it's no different.
I think what Pinchas did is a result of Bilam. When Bilam curse turned into a blessing, he told them that the thing that God really doesn't like is for women to have sex with men. And that's when he enticed the women. So it was against God's will. And so Pinchas really did the work for God.
So what I want to pay attention to is this attribute of zealousness, that both Elijah and Pinchas are the only characters in the Tanakh with this attribute of zealotry. I want to say the Torah and the rabbis hate zealotry. They really reject their leadership models as not successful models. But I want to come to this next text because this is perhaps the reason that the rabbis chose this text for the Haftorah. So next reader, if you could take and lo the Lord.
And lo, the Lord passed by. There was a great and mighty wind, splitting mountains and shattering rocks by the power of the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire, a soft murmuring sound.
Pause it there. For the Hebrew readers, let's spot this. This is the end of verse 12. And the Hebrew kol dama daka.
Mhm.
The translation here, a soft murmuring sound. Kol is sound. Damama is murmuring. Daka is silent. In the King James Bible,
Still small
right,
voice.
beautiful phrase in the King James. It's still small voice. There's a really so. This idea of this moment is very different than a rock and roll show, than the thunder and lightning at Mount Sinai. It's still small.
But first you have the thunder and lightning
You do. And what does the text say about them?
that the Lord.
It's
wasn't
not
there.
God. That's not God.
Well, they're also saying that God has advanced.
Transcended, maybe, transcended the natural world.
Yeah, he is not,
Mama means
It-
quietness. Well, the voice.
Well, mama is a murmur, a quiet murmur. It could
But
be that-
mama can also be silent, quiet.
So it could be that there's one translation is the voice of still silence.
but it actually, that is interesting, yeah, that he's advanced. And
So let's play a very advanced game about this. We're used to thinking about God in that Mount Sinai moment, the 10 Commandments and the thunder and the lightning.
And the voice that was too loud for the people.
They could, yeah, they turned to Moses, you do this. We're not, don't ask us ever to do this again, God, or Moses. Elijah's experience is very different.
but Elijah is also one person.
One person, not everybody.
You said great crowd.
So here's the question for you. Which experience would you prefer to have? Elijah's or Moses's?
I'm thinking Elijah was a prophet. He was already getting the word of God somehow, probably through dreams. So that was pretty quiet. So this makes sense. This is the way he was used to getting it.
Could be that Maimonides creates this hierarchy of prophetic skills. That Moses is the greatest prophet of all time because Moses speaks to God face to face, like one person speaks to another. Everyone else in the Tanakh speaks to God in visions, in dreams, in the nighttime. There's a distancing. But I think this text is saying, let's kind of close that gap a little bit. Let's compare even as a hyperlink, right? This is before we have hyperlinks, but this is a hyperlink to the Moses story. And if you're not inspired by that 10 Commandments moment, maybe you'll find meaning here.
Could it be that because the story of Moses includes the whole nation, so it's thunder and lightning to impress the community? With Elijah, it's person to person.
So which one inspires you? When you have encountered holiness in your life, when you've encountered God, have you encountered God on a mountaintop, or have you encountered God as a still small voice?
Depends on the
In
incident.
the Amidah,
You would hear him in a loud voice, if you were in a crowd. And God were to show you the way out so that you were not hurt in this crowd. Say there was a big incident.
Yeah, okay.
Or say, since we're all still on the Titanic, if you were on the Titanic and you prayed to God, you would want him
but I think we all experience it silently in the Amidah.
if you would hear him and snap to it and say, okay, I gotta think my way out of this.
And
If
so,
you call the mama, it may not reach you.
might not.
You might want to think about it more.
And so, but I do like this idea that during our Amidah, we are moving away from the communal call to our individual introspection, our turn from outward experience to inward discernment.
Yep.
This text seems to have a deep elevation and empowering that inward discernment. And I think for many of us who are trying to figure out how to understand our relationship to holiness and to our own soul, this seems easier to simply stand in silence and
Mhm.
then ask myself, so what's up? How am I doing today? What's really important for me to talk to God about as I'm having my morning Amidah? I want to hold that both models now are going to coexist. And so one thing we can go back to is thinking about when this text gets written is perhaps the editors of the text wanted both models, though they didn't want only the Mount Sinai experience alone. They wanted to have this model as well. That this complicates our ideas of God. It makes it more multidimensional and perhaps makes it very personal. That God is not only there for the big thunder and lightning shows, but God is there in the quiet, in the silence. And that's an aspect of God that we can connect to as well. And both become available to us from this.
Yeah, well, that goes back to Mount Sinai, and then later they build the Mishkan. They want God's presence rather than having a God that is remote, that may be inaccessible or that is frightening or intimidating. Which is why they built the calf. Moses was gone. God, they wanted a substitute, right?
Yeah.
But later, they have not a transcendent God, but a God that is immanent within, that can be approached.
And the verse that we know from this construction of the Mishkan, Va'asuli mikdash, build for me a mikdash so that I may dwell among them.
I have
God wants-
a question. Why is it that on this parasha, the Orthodox had the part to the Amidah in the Musaf?
Say more about that connection.
Pardon? I wonder why is it that
Not
we.
sure.
Pardon?
I'm not sure why that gets part of the Musaf Amidah in Orthodox Siddurim. I don't have a.
They do it only for this parasha, they add to the Amidah. Okay.
Interesting piece, yeah. No, I don't know. Thank you. I can do some research. I do want to now come into how the rabbis and the other characters, 2,000 years ago will take this story and then the rest of the Elijah legacy to heart. Because the end of this story, we know Elijah will not die. He'll be swept up in a whirlwind. And the rabbis become fascinated by that literary opportunity. Oh, if he doesn't die, maybe he's still living. crazy thought, but Midrash is kind of a crazy writing experience. So in the Midrash, we get a variety of Midrashim about what happens to Elijah after he's swept up in the whirlwind. And some of them indicate that Elijah becomes an angelic figure. Elijah is then given specific tasks as this angelic figure to come down and be at every bris, so that he has to begin to be in relationship with people. He's very isolated, and God is saying, no, you now need to go and be there at the birth of every bris. You need to be there at every Shabbat. You need to be there at every Seder. You're going to be the emissary who shows up at these different functions.
When you think about it, Moses, we don't know where Moses is buried because we don't want to worship him.
Yes.
We really don't want to worship Elijah. And so maybe he is swept up so that nobody can.
Maybe. Let's play that game for a minute.
There is
So
one
hang on. We'll get to the difference, but I want to play this game of the death of Moses and the death of Elijah. We're talking about the Midrash now, and how the rabbis take the legacies of these two stories and either amplify them or diminish them. When the rabbis write the Haggadah texts, you take Moses out
Yeah.
for this very reason. They don't want to make Moses become godlike,
But they have Elijah.
but they do amplify Elijah.
When did they add Elijah?
About the same time that Jesus is walking around. So if
Because
you really-
I think it's because Elijah is something that we look forward in the future for coming back. We don't say that about Moses.
Now let's play an interesting history game.
Bimheraya boelenu.
So if we're thinking about the time of Jesus and the time of the Tanaim, the earliest rabbis, they're writing these same texts at the same time, right? The Midrashim that the rabbis are writing and the early gospels are almost contemporary,
Mhm.
like the same literary game. They're both using Midrash, or these explanations, to talk about their understanding. The Christian understanding of Elijah is that not only Elijah, but Elijah's successor, Elisha, are not only going to duplicate the miracles of Moses, but that Jesus will come and duplicate their miracles as well. Jesus will become a new Elijah. Jesus will become a new Elisha. And therefore, John the Baptist is considered the Elijah character, the reincarnation who will announce the coming of the Messiah. And in Christian communities, John the Baptist is considered the one who announces the coming of the Messiah. So from the Christian lens, this series of stories comes to full fruition with Jesus. The rabbis don't go in that direction, but they do permit this expansiveness around Elijah, which is fascinating.
All the miracles
Mhm.
that Jesus performed are straight out of.
Exactly. They're Tanakh stories. Each and every miracle out of Jesus is a Tanakh story that gets retold in a different way.
But you could also say that, yeah. All right, so John is announcing that Jesus is Elijah.
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
By the way,
Okay.
to change the subject, what struck me in this parsha is, as a woman, that the 5 daughters are all named, which is unusual.
Yeah.
for-
I thought about teaching the Banot Zelofchad, but I figure I'll save that for another time. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous story about these 5 daughters and who hear that have their voices. I want to have a different feminist agenda at the moment, though. I'm going to take a sivuv, a turn about feminism in a different direction about Elijah, though, because the rabbis of the Talmud not only put the text for the Haggadah together, they invent out of whole cloth the new ritual called Seder. Seder didn't exist at the time of Elijah. Seder didn't exist for 800 years after Elijah. The rabbis have the first Seder. They need to have a reinvention of Passover because the temple is destroyed. They can't offer sacrifices. And they know that this spring ritual is so important to them. They've got to come up with something brand new and revolutionary. And they develop the Seder. At that first Seder, here's a trivia note about the Seder. It wasn't the last dinner because the rabbis don't invent it for about 75, 100 years after the death of Jesus. What it was, the Last Supper, was a Yom Tov meal, a Soda. Soda mitzvah, right? You're going to have a large meal because it's Passover. So the Last Supper is really the matzah and the charoset and the maror from your Soda. It was not the Seder. The Seder comes probably 50 to 100 years after. But what's missing from that first Seder? Elijah's cup doesn't exist. For 1,000 years, Jews are using the 4 cups of wine and the 4 matzot, and they're saying the 4 questions.
3 matzot.
Then about the time of Rambam, Maimonides, there becomes a new question. Should there be a 5th cup of wine? How much wine can you drink at Seder? But yes, the rabbis have this machloket. Maybe there could be a 5th cup for this messianic dream. And so about 600 years ago, we begin to see in Jewish legal response literature, the development of a 5th cup. And it's Elijah's cup that's placed on the Seder table alongside the Seder plate. They are reinventing their own rituals, enhancing them, making them more beautiful. And so when I was preparing for Seder this year, I was doing a little bit of this history research about the Elijah's cup and how this new ritual's only been around for about 600, maybe 700 years. It develops at the time of the Kabbalists from the Zohar, who magnify Elijah even more. And they fall in love with this prophetic dream that at the end of Seder, we talk about the future, the messianic dream, and how we can have this new symbol to have this dream on our table.
But we also mention Elia the Havdalah.
So the piece I want to connect though is this idea of creative new ritual doesn't just end with the rabbis 600 years ago. For the last 50 years, feminists have put a 2nd cup next to Elijah's cup. It's a Kos Miriam. It's a cup of Miriam. And Miriam's cup doesn't have wine in it, it has water. Because all the Midrashim are connected through Miriam about water.
Yes.
So one of the things I was teaching my community last night was the Reform movement gets a lot of criticism for reinventing things out of whole cloth because it's convenient, easy. The cup of Miriam alongside Elijah's cup is beautiful. It's a perfect use of the traditional ways of enhancing and making more beautiful our beautiful ceremonies, alongside the idea of amplifying another prophet's voice. That we're not just amplifying Moses and Elijah today, we're also hearing the voice of a woman prophet, Miriam, and having her voice. About 50 years ago. I did some research this spring, and about 50 years ago, they began experimenting with a Kos Miriam with a cup of water.
Saying that.
I want to say it's a counter to something even more dramatic than Christianity, is the anti-Semitism of the Crusades and the martyrdom of medieval Jews being killed by Christian swords. So yes.
Because if you read the text of when we open the door for him,
Yes, yes.
you know, most people just read the English, it's extremely violent.
It's very violent. Yes.
Extremely. So to me, that has to be direct. Historically, what's happening.
Exactly right.
At that time.
So what I want to kind of conclude this on is this feminist perspective that when we do these rituals well, we reinvent them and reform them and make them more beautiful, if we do them with kavanah, with intentionality, if we do them with integrity alongside how the tradition has shifted and changed. there's beauty there. So I want to finish this off today that we can hold not just Elijah and his expanding storyline, but we can hold Miriam as a prophet that we can pay attention to. So much so that our brand new Siddur, the Lev Shalem, both the Shabbat Siddur and the Machzor, now include Miriam's name at Milchamocha. That didn't exist 50 years ago. Your Siddur, Sim Shalom, didn't include Miriam's name. Now it does. The times are changing. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat